From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the African and Middle East Division. I'm Mary Jane Deeb, Chief of the Division, and I'm delighted to see you all here. We always start the program with a sort of general introduction about our division, what we do, and why we think you should return to our division for many more programs. So this division is responsible for the collections from 78 different countries, the entire continent of Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. And we are divided into three sections: the African section, the Hebraic section, and we collect worldwide for the Hebraic section, and the Near East section. We serve collections in the languages of the region. And I will explain this in a minute. But our collections, we are a custodial collection and a custodian division. And our materials are in the scripts and the languages of these countries. So were you to do research on Ethiopia, the materials in Ge'ez, in Amharic, would be here. But if you were interested in reading what people said in English, in French, in German, in Italian, and so on, those would be spread throughout the library and primarily in the general collections. If you're interested in law materials on Ethiopia, you'd have to go to the law library. If you're interested in films, you'd have to go to motion pictures. What I'm saying is that we only have the materials in the vernacular, but the others for research are spread throughout the library. And this is why it's such an exciting thing to be here, because you can come to us, and then we'll send you all over the library as well. We also organize programs. We have symposia, we have workshops, we have displays, we have exhibits, and we have parties sometimes. We always include everyone to taste our foods from different regions. So this is a way of getting a feel for the cultures. And through the eyes and writings of our speakers, our programs are enriched. Our books come to life, and our 78 countries are no longer just places on a map, but living, breathing entities that are rich in history and culture, and that are an intrinsic part of today's global civilization. Today we have a person who's going to enlighten us in a field that we are not always very familiar with. And I will leave it hanging without saying more, but we have Gregory Copley. He's the president of the International Strategic Studies Association, and he will be talking to us about a unique book that he wrote a few years ago, and I understand is being updated. His lecture today is entitled Imperial Ethiopia's Unique Symbols, Structures, and Role in the Modern World. And he will be further introduced. But before I continue any further, I want to also to recognize the presence of Prince Eremias, the grandson of the Emperor Haile Selassie, and some members of his family. We are delighted to have you here. As usual, Prince Eremias also gave us a talk a few years ago, and perhaps he'll come back and give us another. And now, to introduce our speaker is our own Fentahun Tirune, the specialist for Ethiopia and Eritrea, here in the African and Middle Eastern Division of the Library of Congress. Now, I want you to know that Fentahun has just been named Grand Officer of the Imperial Order of the Star of Honor of Ethiopia by His Imperial Highness Prince Ermias, and this great honor was bestowed upon him for, and I'm quoting, great wisdom and dedication in the preservation and promulgation of documents and archives of the Ethiopic languages in the United States, in the Library of Congress of the United States. And it has reflected great prestige and distinction on the Ethiopian peoples and their history. So I wanted everyone to recognize also that our Fentahun Terune has been very much honored for his work and for for developing those collections and those programs and knowledge about Ethiopia here at the Library of Congress and beyond. So without further ado, let me introduce Fenta, who will introduce the speaker in turn. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Jane. Prince Ermias, distinguished guests, and ladies and gentlemen, I'm so happy to see all of you here for this important program in which a good friend of mine, Gregory Copley, is going to speak on a very important topic about imperial symbols, structures, and the role in the modern world, a subject that has been forgotten or ignored for a long time. But before I begin to introduce our speaker, I would like to impart some information to you. There will be a modest reception in our conference room right behind me, in which you'll get an opportunity to speak to our guest on a personal level. And His Royal Highness Prince Ermias had given us a wonderful lecture in 2010, and that lecture on the Lion of Judah was made into a booklet, and we have about 20 for you to pick on a first-come, first-served basis in the conference room. And then before I introduce our speaker, I would like to remind you that this event is being videotaped for future webcasting on the library's webpage. By asking questions and or making comments, you're consenting that your voice and image be recorded and later broadcast as part of the event, and the possible reproduction and transmission of your remarks. And thank you for your understanding. And then I will be reading just a brief biography of Gregory. Gregory Copley, president of the International Strategic Studies Association, abbreviated ISSA, based in the Washington, D.C. area, is the Australian author, philosopher, and industrialist. He has for almost 5 decades worked as an advisor at head of government ministerial or head of service levels in the areas of strategic policy, intelligence, security, and economics. He authored the 1998 book, Ethiopia Reaches Her Hand Unto God, Imperial Ethiopia's Unique Symbols, Structures, and Role in the Modern World. He has subsequently been actively engaged in studying issues relating to the Ethiopian monarchy, and in 2016 created at ISSA the Center for the Study of Monarchy, Traditional Governance, and Sovereignty. He has authored or co-authored 34 books on strategic philosophy, history, geopolitics, psychological strategy, and information dominance, energy, aviation, national planning, and poetry. He has written several thousand published and classified articles and studies, and was made a member of the Order of Australia in the 2017 Queen's Birthday honors for his services to strategic analysis. As an industrialist, he has owned shipyards and a ship design firm in the UK, a chemicals company in France, and was vice chairman of Scotland's national airline. National Airline Highland Express. One of his companies has developed unique deployable water purification systems specifically to meet Ethiopia's challenges. His 2012 book, Uncivilization, Urban Geopolitics in a Time of Chaos, and a later book, Rise of the Red Med, How the Mediterranean Red Sea Nexus is Resuming its Strategic Centrality, published in 2016, deal with current and future strategic issues. He is editor-in-chief and founder in 1972 of Defense and Foreign Affairs Publications, and the director of intelligence at the Global Information System and an online encrypted access global intelligence service which provides strategic current intelligence solely to governments. One of his books, The Art of Victory, published in 2006, has been used as a text in a number of military colleges. He is chairman of the Water Initiative for Africa. He appears regularly on US and international radio and television programs discussing strategic issues. He is a fellow of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society and a member of the advisory board for the Canadian Force College Foundation, where he lectures regularly. Please help me welcome Gregory Copley.
Thank you, Fender. We're going to have to get a shorter bio. Tenastaling, Your Imperial Highness, Prince Selassie, Haile Selassie, President of the Crown Council of Ethiopia, distinguished guests, my profound thanks firstly to Dr. D, but also to my greatly admired friend, Fender Nturona, for organizing this event today at this important center of learning and preservation. And of course, my congratulations to him for that recent award of Ethiopia's great imperial symbol, the Order of Grand Officer of the Star of Honor of Ethiopia. Well, it's been 2 decades since I wrote the book, Ethiopia Reaches a Hand Unto God, Imperial Ethiopia's Unique Symbols, Structures, and Role in the Modern World. And that was done with the profound assistance of His Imperial Highness Prince Ermias. It's remarkable that interest in the book has grown with the years rather than diminished, and the book continues to sell, much to my astonishment. But part of this is because we are witnessing a strong resurgence in the unique identity of Ethiopia and Ethiopians. This is not just because Ethiopia is finally recovering from the cultural devastation of the coup of 1974. It's also related to the fact that the transforming global social environment is forcing many people around the world to become conscious of their core identities. We are globally entering a period of identity politics, a time when people yearn to understand why they are who they are, why they are special, and what their special relationship is with their geography. This introspection is neither accidental nor coincidental. It's a direct response to the threat felt to their identities by many peoples in the face of the globalism ideology which stressed the irrelevance of borders and nations. Bear in mind, this is quite separate from the mechanisms of globalization of communications and trade, although these have helped feed the globalism philosophy, which is essentially an urban phenomenon in a world which is increasingly urbanizing and increasingly materialistic. Identity, however, is both visceral and psychological. It's the tool which builds the frame of logic in individuals and in societies. It gives a sense of self-worth, purpose, legitimacy, as well as a sense of comprehension as to how people fit into their particular geographic surroundings. And this gives them their understandings of the seasons and what survival demands of them, individually as well as in a genetic sense. It gives group cohesion and therefore productivity. I've described this as a terroir relationship, to use the French expression, the linkage between people and their particular geography. Of course, urban societies develop their own terroir relationship with their concrete geography, and the urban sense of geopolitics has driven much of the globalist philosophy against the classical, or shall we say Westphalianist, sense of nationhood and national identity. Ethiopia still has one of the lower rates of urbanization in the world. Some 17.3% of the population was urbanized as of 2015. one of the lowest rates in the world, and certainly well below the sub-Saharan African average of 37%. But urbanization is growing dramatically in the country, possibly at an estimated 5.4% a year. For most Ethiopians, their sense of identity was rooted in the specialness related to the conviction that they were chosen by God, favored by God, that God had a special commitment to their welfare. This belief had more than 3 millennia of evolution, based on the union between King Solomon and Queen Makeda of Saba. And the belief system came into a civilization which in biblical times was already well established among the Cushitic peoples. The union of King Solomon and Queen Makeda introduced the second Zion as a Jewish-dominated state, which ultimately began transformation to a Christian-dominated state from the 4th century AD. Well, it's important to note that Ethiopia also has a special relationship with Islam. The Prophet Muhammad, having sent his family and followers to safety in Ethiopia from Mecca, bestowed a special significance on Ethiopia as a place for the coexistence of peoples of different faiths but sharing national identity. The transition from a Jewish-dominated society to a Christian-dominated society did not diminish the power of the Solomonic imagery to help sustain the Ethiopian sense of uniqueness. If anything, the later introduction of Western education in Ethiopia, compounding during the 20th century period of Haile Selassie and opening still further during the Republican years, has only served to broaden the Ethiopian sense of specialness, given that it now also embraces much greater study of the pre-Solomonic Cushitic periods and civilization, and also the origins of modern mankind in the Rift Valley with the finding of the skeletal remains of Australopithecus afarensis. But my brief here today is to discuss the issues of symbology relating to the Imperial period, the Ethiopia's symbols and structures and roles in the modern world. And that essentially focuses to a large extent on the impact inside Ethiopia and on the outside world of what became the iconic Solomonic crown and its rituals and hierarchies. Certainly the post-coup period in Ethiopia, that is since 1974, finds the country and its people in an entirely new global strategic context. Nothing, of course, ever returns to the way it was, which is why the potency of the Solomonic imagery is significant in that it continues to galvanize thought, even though the Ethiopian society and the global context have become dramatically more complex. And the intellectual offerings have challenged traditional religions and beliefs, particularly with urban-centric and more materialistic logic. But let me reiterate that as the world broadens, not just for Ethiopians, but for all of us, there is a tendency to see a reactive search among peoples for their identity, their core identity. It's a search for horizons, purpose, and uniqueness. Well, this sense of self-belief, sustained by the presence of an iconic bloodline, in the case of Ethiopia, the Solomonic bloodline, in the face of all other adversity in Ethiopia over more than 3 millennia, was responsible for creating and sustaining a civilizational model. This civilization, while not wealthy by world standards, provides a unique perspective on the entire question of the survival of the social identity. Ethiopia's identity and mission was committed to writing as the national saga of the Ethiopic peoples in the form of the Kebra Negest, the Glory of Kings, possibly in the 6th century AD. And this served to elevate the specialness of the people further, sustaining them through great hardship. Little wonder that the periods when Ethiopians were separated from their iconic sense of specialness, perhaps during the non-Solomonic Zagwe dynasty between the 10th and 13th centuries, or during the fractured period of the Zamana Mesafent, the era of princes and judges from 1769 to 1855, they lost some of their sense of special purpose. And little wonder, too, that when Emperor Theodorus began the modern Solomonic period in 1855, the country regained some consciousness of its historical sense of mission. Emperor Theodorus's successor, Johannes IV, in particular, began building on the iconographic foundation laid by the mystical power of the Kebra Negest. and the accompanying pervasive religious authority of the Orthodox Church. He, and particularly Emperor Menelik II, began building structures of authority around the Solomonic line, using the symbols of the crown's authority to build that mystical connection between the throne and the many varied peoples of the Ethiopian Empire. It's possible that this began the most significant use of symbols of authority of the crown since the great totemic constructions of Aksum, such as the famous stelae of Aksum in the first millennium of the modern era. The fact that Emperor Menelik so successfully routed the Italian invasion of Ethiopia at the Battle of Adwa on March the 1st and 2nd in 1896 was itself a rallying point for Ethiopia and Ethiopian prestige. It was this event in which the emperor's wife, Empress Taitu, played a role which was reminiscent of the powerful and unique Queen of Sheba, Queen Makada. And this started a chain of events which played out in bringing to an end the European colonial expansion in Africa. It was Emperor Menelik's enormous victory, the first such victory by an African state against a modern European power, which gave Ethiopia the prestige and leadership to create the Pan-African concepts, to eventually be the beacon of independence for the African colonies. It's absolutely clear that Emperor Menelik's victory ultimately enabled Emperor Haile Selassie I in 1963 to create and host the Organization for African Unity, now the African Union, as the precursor to the post-colonial period. Indeed, no one actually honed this use of symbols and intricate social hierarchy more than Emperor Haile Selassie when he came to full imperial power in 1930. Such was the prestige and authority of the emperor and Ethiopia by late 1935, when the Italians again invaded the country, that it was the emperor's scolding words to the League of Nations which ended international hypocrisy over Italy's blatant misuse of arms. You'll all recall his parting words as he left the podium at the League of Nations. He said, "Today it is us, tomorrow it will be you." The League of Nations was in fact finished because it was so exposed as hollow by the emperor's globally recognized address in June 1936. But this was to be followed by the fact that Ethiopia, with British assistance, achieved the first Allied victory of World War II when it drove the occupying Italians from the country in 1941. Ethiopians recovered, regrouped, and reasserted their Solomonic identity after that 5-year interregnum in the dynasty. From that point forward, the emperor believed fervently in the philosophy of collective security, committing Ethiopian troops, particularly the Imperial Guard Regiment, to the United Nations force in the Korean War. The Ethiopians' heroism and professionalism was greatly praised and decorated by the United States. Emperor Haile Selassie's enormous international stature had a profound and lasting impact on the world. The emerging black nationalist and Pan-Africanist movements in the Americas, led by Jamaica's Marcus Garvey, saw in Emperor Haile Selassie a figurehead and inspiration which led to the creation of the Rastafarian movement. And it was the Rastafarian religion which was to play an important role in sustaining the unique imagery of the Solomonic line after the coup of 1974. But before that, it was the emperor's visits to the United States, starting in 1954, which were so inspirational to African Americans that they provided an impetus for the US civil rights movement, which gathered pace from that point onwards. This was addressed well in the 2011 book by Theodore Vestal, The Lion of Judah in the New World, Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia and the Shaping of Americans' Attitudes Towards Africa. Emperor Haile Selassie consciously and fervently believed in the mission handed down to him and in his responsibility to build first the dignity and secondly the capability of the Ethiopian people. And to do this, he stressed the mysticism of the historical authority of the Solomonic bloodline, which he codified in the 1955 Constitution stipulation on succession to the throne, and in the respect that he gave to the prestige and authority of the regional and national hierarchies and officers, and to the importance of Ethiopia's unique system of ranks, titles, and honors, which set it apart from the world. This was not merely to give authority to the crown itself, or to the makwanent, the upper nobility, or the Negosawi Betasab, the royal and imperial households, but to give everyone a sense of place within the hierarchy of the society, to give each person a sense of purpose and dignity. It's significant that Emperor Haile Selassie simultaneously embarked on an ambitious and almost helter-skelter dash towards the Western education of as many Ethiopians as possible, perhaps without understanding that this introduced a competitive and less mystical thrust into Ethiopian society. It introduced materialism, which challenged the stoicism of the society, and which demanded the satisfaction of desires and ambitions at a pace which no emerging economy could satisfy. There are many reasons why this fundamental contradiction which Emperor Haile Selassie introduced into Ethiopian society led to the coup of 1974 and to the wasteland created by the Derg which seized power. Some of this is addressed in Prince Asfawasan Asarate's revealing book King of Kings in 2015, as well as in Professor Gezachu Taruna's important 2015 book, The Rise and Fall of the Solomonic Dynasty of Ethiopia. But this clash of more than 3 millennia of mysticism, nurtured and strengthened in isolation, and the materialism of the 20th century external world, which became unavoidable after World War II, also came to a head as the emperor was aging and without the succession base which he'd spent his life trying to assemble for the transition to the next generation. It also came as the great superpowers of the world, the United States and the USSR, were at a crucial time in their own titanic confrontation. The technologies of that confrontation between the West and the Soviet bloc also coincided with the exhaustion of the emperor and the rising demands of social expectations which the emperor's education, modernization, and emancipation had set in train. The US, long a tacit guardian of Ethiopia in the post-World War II era, had improved its intelligence collection capabilities to the point where it no longer felt that it needed the electronic intelligence station at Kanyu Station, Asmara, in what is now Eritrea. So while the US kept the station going until 1977, 3 years after the coup against the emperor, Washington had made it clear that it was no longer interested in being the strategic partner of Ethiopia. The USSR, on the other hand, had long invested in radicalizing the newly educated youth of Ethiopia, the youth who the emperor had so willingly thrust into the urban mainstream of international learning. The Soviet Comintern, the Communist International, the center of Soviet psychological operations, at that time run by the master psychological warrior Boris Nikolaevich Ponomarov, created in Moscow a political propaganda publication to subvert Ethiopian youth. The Soviets named the publication Kesta Demana, the rainbow from God. This was a breathtaking theft of a highly religious and particularly Ethiopian symbology about the special relationship which God had with the Ethiopian people. In Soviet hands, it became just one more tool to take away Ethiopia's sense of specialness. And this whole Soviet campaign struck a chord at the same time that Washington was neglecting the emperor. Thus, once again, with the coup of 1974, Ethiopia seemed to have been robbed of its identity and purpose. The coup masters destroyed, or seemed to have destroyed, in an instant, the 3,500 years of Solomonic identity, and for the next 43 years, it appeared that Ethiopia had seen all vestiges of its specialness erased. They were to be just another poor African country. But it's now clear that this was not meant to be. There is now an unprecedented level of interest from Ethiopians inside Ethiopia and in the diaspora, as well as among international scholars, as to why Ethiopia was so special and what Emperor Haile Selassie did to raise its profile, unity, and sense of purpose. There's now a growing appetite among Ethiopians that they must either regain that identity or revert to very narrow ethnic and linguistic groupings. It seems that the trend favors the search for a path back to that Ethiopianness, which has a great sense of personal and group identity, as well as in rediscovering international prestige, rather than taking the difficult and isolating task of creating new personae around ethnic and linguistic subgroups. What's significant is that considerable interest in the Ethiopian identity is beginning to resurge among the Ethiopian diaspora, which has become a distinct grouping virtually entirely within the urban areas of its host countries. We see the yearning for an ancient identity coming from the diaspora peoples who have not been able to shake that sense of separateness from their new host communities. The maturing of expatriate Ethiopians, many of whom had become associated with Western values and education during the late Haile Selassie period, to the point where they begin to search for their origins, and it's now become profound. Unsurprisingly, this example, for example, this has led to the fostering of important centers of inquiry into Ethiopian history in Western universities and at such institutions as Sahai publishes at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. Thus, the flame of the Solomonic line has been nurtured outside Ethiopia during the period of the interregnum. In much the same way, the flame of Persia, Zoroaster, has been kept alive by expatriate Zoroastrian and Parsi communities in their diaspora, largely in Canada, while the Shia Muslim domination of Iran has suppressed the traditional Persian identities. What's significant, too, is that much of Ethiopia's iconic documentation has been kept secure outside the country, and including particularly at such institutions as the US Library of Congress. And for the time being, the very Solomonic crown of the Ethiopian peoples itself resides with the Crown Council under Prince Ermias in exile in the diaspora. Indeed, what has emerged in the 43 years of the interregnum since the coup against Emperor Haile Selassie, and it's important to note that it was in fact a coup by a small military group and not a popular revolution. It's important to note that it's the diaspora of Ethiopians caused by the coup which have become globally visible. Conservatively, there are some 3 million Ethiopians living outside Ethiopia at present, and I venture to say it's considerably more than that, compared with only a handful of such expatriates living abroad less than a century earlier. And expatriates contribute between 1.5 billion and I hear 4.7 billion a year in foreign exchange remittances to the Ethiopian economy. The Ethiopian diaspora represents a very distinct new profile of the nation in the international consciousness. But equally, this group is now maturing and reflecting on what it means to be of Ethiopian origin. It's natural that some of the ethnic divisions in such a diverse society as Ethiopia are being reflected within the diaspora. But what's been interesting is the fact that Ethiopia's 60 or so ethnic groups appear to have in the diaspora largely identified themselves as Ethiopian and only secondarily as members of the ethnic and linguistic subgroups. Much of this unity in exile is due to the overwhelming impact of historical symbols, including religion, although, of course, as I said, not all Ethiopians are united behind the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, around symbols such as language and by the teachings of the Gebra Negest and the Feta Negest, the law of kings, but also including the iconography which was so strongly promoted by Emperor Haile Selassie. Well, the time is now right for these vital elements of Ethiopia's identity to be regathered into Ethiopia. We've recently seen the creation in Addis Ababa of the Meles Zenawi Library to honor the recent and late Prime Minister. So it's fitting that the diaspora community and the Crown Council are now interested in the creation of a prestigious new center, the Haile Selassie I Library and Conference Center, to be built hopefully in Addis Ababa at a location where the great learning and symbols of the Solomonic era can be brought together. With the creation of such an institution, much of Ethiopia's documentary and physical heritage could be brought home to the country and gathered together from private collections around the world. The centre could be a focus of research and learning on the lessons of the past 3,500 years, contributing to the continuation of what is essentially an unbroken chain of Ethiopian history, totally compatible with its evolution, modernization, and rising role in the New World. Such a library would actually fit well into the modern state structure of Ethiopia and has already received private encouragement from various government officials. There's good reason for that support. The 3,500-year Solomonic history is the unbroken lifeline of the Judeo-Christian civilizations, even Abrahamic civilization as a whole, and it's the heritage of all Ethiopians, including the government of the Republic of Ethiopia. But it's also the historical bloodline, the lifeline of the modern world as a whole, and as such the library could attract significant international attention. This does not in any way preclude discussion of pre-Solomonic Ethiopia or today's Republican Ethiopia. It's about recognizing a totemic aspect of Ethiopian identity and its relationship with modern civilization. What became clear as I began to explore in that book we published in 1998, Ethiopia Reaches a Hand Unto God, is that Ethiopians have developed a unique cultural and civilizational position throughout history. It's true that this position lost momentum briefly during the current interregnum, but the sense of identity built around not only the physical iconography, but also around the memory of Haile Selassie and his predecessors is returning at a significant pace. Clearly, we are just at the beginning of this renaissance. How the Ethiopian people and government use this revival of historical identity could well be strategically important. And with that, I hope to thank you and Mesa Ganaldo, and turn to you for questions. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, Doctor.
First of all, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation, and very much enjoyed it. So what were some of the symbols that were used in the most recent revival?
Well, particularly since Emperor Theodros' period, we saw that the traditional titles and ranks and hierarchies which were differed around Ethiopia were given greater prominence. So the various historical ranks, some of them from very distinct regions, were honored by the Ethiopian Empire as a whole. There were various other titles, Dejazmach and Fitarawi and so on, which had their own special meanings, and they gave a sense of uniqueness to people's place in the society, much the same way as the European hierarchical structures evolved, but it was uniquely Ethiopian. And in many respects, it was compounded by the sense of isolation of the Amhara highland particularly. And this actually was the reason why the victory of Adwa was made possible, because this was a structure and a logic system which applied not only to society but also to military operations, which enabled Emperor Menelik to conduct a battle against the Ethiopians which the Italians could not understand. They had based all of their analysis on going into Ethiopia on other African adventures by colonial powers and on what seemed to be the sweeping success of the British under General Napier against Emperor Theodros. And as such, they actually misunderstood how Ethiopian society and the logistics pattern of the society, the way it fed its society, fed its military structure, was conducted. So that was particularly important. And this was about, if you like, non-physical iconography, but within, it was definitely an iconic sense of the country. There were others, of course, the belief that the Star of David concept itself was created in ancient Ethiopia. The fact that Ethiopian colors became so significant that they came to represent Pan-Africanism and so on. But what most of the emperors, particularly Johannes onwards, started adapting their symbols of recognition to accord with, to a degree, with international standards, and they created the great orders like the Star of Ethiopia, like the Order of the Holy Trinity, the Order of Solomon and Sheba, the Order of Solomon itself, and so on. These all became items which reinforced the sense of hierarchy in the country. Of course, the sense of grandeur was always there from the ruins and stelae of Axum, and in the belief that, of course, that within St. Mary's Church in Axum lay the Ark of the Covenant, which gave great symbolic importance to the church. The church, the role of the church in fostering that Ethiopian sense of identity can't be underestimated. Even its impact on non-Christian elements of Ethiopian society has been profound, because it does give a sense of timelessness to the whole Ethiopian society. So it's perhaps, in a sense, the iconography of Ethiopia has been less physical than, say, the Roman and Hellenic civilizations, or even the British sense of construction, where great cities have tended to be the iconography which gave power to Rome, London, and so on. But in fact, it may be that the Ethiopian society is all the more durable for the fact that its icons are psychological more than they are visual. So. The common enemy. Well, thank you for that. I mean, I'm going to, if I forget to answer any specific point, just remind me. But firstly, the Jewish nature of Ethiopia before the 4th century is pretty well documented. Now, of course, the reporting of the Copley and other documents show the creation of the second Zion after Menelik I, the son of Queen Makada of Saba, went back to Jerusalem and met with Solomon, and then returned with a lot of the firstborn of the noble families of Israel and Judah at that time. And of course, under Ethiopian myth, that's when they brought the Ark of the Covenant back with them. That's subsequently been open to debate. But clearly there was a Jewish society under Menelik I, lasting until the conversion of the kings in the 4th century. And then you started the predominantly Christian era. So yes, there was, and by the way, it was not a unique situation for there to be Jewish kingdoms in the region, in Arabia and so on as well as up into the areas around the Caspian. So I mean, this was a common phenomenon. You asked about the Solomonic links with the era of princes and judges, and in fact, yes, there was clearly a Solomonic thread running through all of that as well, but because of the dispersed leadership in that period, when there was a lot of regional infighting, you didn't have this iconic central power of a Solomonic emperor during that brief period until 1855, when it was re-galvanized under Tewodros. But you're right in suggesting that Emperor Haile Selassie not only was the only viable choice to lead the country when he was chosen first as regent, and then Negus, and then later as Emperor Negus, and I guess in 1930, he was outstandingly visionary from a global perspective. He was, as you say, progressive in the best sense of the word, in that he wanted excellence and education, and he did so without a foundation of great wealth. So he actually introduced modern education, he introduced modern infrastructure, technology, and so on. He was enlightened, and it was no accident that, and I didn't mention it in this, but no accident that he was highly engaged in the non-aligned movement, because he was looking for bridges between the worlds. Here's the irony: he was heavily involved in creating the non-aligned movement and sustaining that, at the same time as he exhibited a belief in collective security, which is why he committed so strongly to the United Nations and the United Nations mission in Korea, for example. In fact, the revolution against him, or the coup against him rather, and the so-called revolutionary thought, which was introduced later by the Derg, was absolutely regressive, to my mind, in the sense that it was an attempt to stop some of this broad liberal democratic ideals which the emperor had. I mean, he was clearly a proponent of a constitutional monarchy and a stable democratically elected government. And had he been given the time, I think we would have seen Ethiopia not only have stable democratic institutions to this day, but also great economic benefits as a result of that, without compromising Ethiopia's sense of its unique identity. So, does that address that, do you think? Thanks.
First of all, thank you very much. I want to say thank you to the Library of Congress for hosting this event. I want to thank, I don't know what I should say, Dr. Copley, Professor Copley, General Copley, but certainly our brother Greg Copley, for a wonderful piece of work. I want to acknowledge the presence here of the President of our Crown Council, His Selassie, Haile Selassie. And as someone who was born in the Caribbean, I want to say a few things. I want to thank the gentleman for very excellent points made. My father was in the British Army in 2011. I think Gregory had an opportunity to meet him. And he remembers as a child in the 1930s, enormous outpouring of support for Ethiopia because the English-speaking Caribbean developed alongside the United States. So they have newsreels in those days. When the Emperor spoke to the League of Nations, they began, after the invasion, they started, as I said to this about a year before we started, collecting money to buy planes and armaments for Ethiopia. And that's way before Bob Marley. People do not understand the genesis of Bob Marley. And the British government passed away all the British allies, saying that no more than £1 sterling can be sent to the United States by anyone in the Association started by the Jamaican philosopher and Pan-Africanist Marcus Garvey. Some actually made their way to Ethiopia, like Herbert Fauntleroy Julian from Grenada. Others, like the gentleman Robinson, the Brown Condor, made his way to Ethiopia and did the best they could. But this was all before the OAU. So even in the period in the early 1900s after Adwa, through the 1920s, when the coronation took place, people in the African diaspora saw Ethiopia as a beacon of African independence. And the emperor did something majestic after the war. He, as you said, accelerated the education process. And Prince Louis can correct me, but I believe it was said that he actually used his palace for the founding of Addis Ababa University, Haile Selassie University, which would be analogous to Queen Elizabeth using Buckingham Palace to begin Oxford. We need to understand this because it puts the emperor in that progressive light that we often talk about, in a way that we've not understood. Which other African leader or potentate has used his presidential palace, a palace of any kind, to facilitate education? No. I want to say one more thing that really speaks to the majestic effort that you have unfolded before us today. And that is, one of my friends studied in Cuba. He married a daughter of one of the officers of the Imperial Guard. His name is Conjure Gabriel. His son's name is Carlos Menelik Paso. When he went to Ethiopia during the days of the Derg on holiday to meet a family, after they got married, he wrote me a letter. Because unlike in Ethiopia, where people who were on the political left were against the emperor, the nationalist movement in the Caribbean and in the African diaspora supported the emperor. And he said to me, this regime will not last. I said, why? In a follow-up, and he said, well, I went to Addis Ababa. I saw portraits of Marx and Lenin, and I saw no puppets again. So in his own way, he was saying, how could you build a civilization when you had cut away its very foundation? You may have had issues with different leaders, but that heritage, that identity that needed to be preserved was the observation that he made. And of course, we know that his remark came to pass. So, in concluding, I would like to ask that you maybe touch a little bit on the role that the African diaspora has played in the maintenance of that image and that heritage, and why do you believe, in fact, they stuck with the image of the emperor and the progressive nature of the Ethiopian monarchy when so many in Africa, maybe in Ethiopia itself, abandoned that?
Well, I think that the abandonment, if you like, of the imperial imagery and for a brief period during the Derg occurred because it was enforced. You know, the pictures of the emperor were forcibly removed. People did hide them away. But ultimately, you know, that was a mistake. I mean, the Soviet influence absolutely did a disservice to itself by not trying to co-opt Ethiopia's history to a greater degree. They had succeeded, as I mentioned, with the creation of that magazine called, you know, the Rainbow of God, basically trying to initially co-opt an Ethiopian symbol. Then they abandoned it, and maybe because it was Mengistu Haile Mariam that he wanted to show obeisance to Moscow, that he basically introduced entirely foreign iconography, which doesn't work. And one of the things that we're seeing around the world today is this cry from most societies: we want our country back, whatever that means. And I don't think most people know what it means, but they know, they want to know that their whole purpose, their ancestry and so on, has some meaning, not to just start fresh again. We saw with the collapse of the Soviet Union 70 years after the decree that a new Soviet man would be created. 70 years later, with the collapse of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, we saw an absolute revival of things absolutely suppressed for 70 years. The church, the iconic Russian construction styles, the reverence for the for the monarchy of the past. Certainly the past always carries with it a lot of baggage, but it also, as does our individual history, we have the good and the bad within us, and but it's ours, and that's the most important thing. So I think that we've seen a 43-year interregnum thus far, but that doesn't mean that Ethiopians have forgotten or will forget. I know there's concern that young Ethiopians in the diaspora and in the country will have no experience or understanding of their history. The same applied to Iran since the coup of 78, 79. The reality there is that today in Iran we see a flourishing of the main form of protest is the printing of the most elaborate books of poetry by Ferdowsi or Mukhayyam and the like, the most lavish the tributes being paid to the Persianness of the history, and the only way they can do it is to make books printed with gold ink and the like. I mean, it's anything they can do to show this reverence for their past, because they can't express it in an opposition to the current clerical leadership there. And gets to the point of, a friend made the point about the enemy of the emperor. Enemies were Mengistu Haile Mariam and Meles Zenawi, and to a degree that's true. But it's like saying that atheism is a disbelief in God, but in fact atheism becomes its own religion, and the opposition to the emperor became its own religion, almost validating the emperor, if you like, because they set their standards were set up as being opposed to the emperor, which meant that the society itself would ultimately come to compare the two. And what we're seeing today with the Ethiopian government is, for the first time, we're seeing this opening up to Ethiopia's history, and the government is seeing that this has some healing benefits. So this is why when we raised the issue of creating the Haile Selassie I library and conference centre, several government officials have commented favourably, and one said, "Oh, I think we can find land to donate for that." Well, this is a profound transformation of attitudes, because we have to bear in mind that the present government, which was opposed, which came into being as an opposition force to the Derg, was itself Marxist in origin, and so it's been gradually coming back to a sense of nationalism in the best sense, in the sense of creating an Ethiopia based on Ethiopians rather than on necessarily imported political models. I think as with any society, it's always got a long way to go. When you look at the United States, how difficult it was to progress the idea of a truly United States nation, only really started to occur with the war with the British in 1812, some considerable period after the 1776 revolution. So we may get impatient for Ethiopia to rebuild its glory, and Ethiopians are justifiably impatient, but we can see it happening, and we can see that the diaspora played a critical role in that, the Caribbean particularly, and the creation of the Rastafarian religion, which I know was a source of some bewilderment and embarrassment to the emperor, who was a devout Christian, and one of his great successes, of course, is that Bob Marley, in his love for the emperor, converted to Christianity on his deathbed. So, and now we see the Rastafari religion also coming to an accommodation with the Orthodox Church. So it's becoming an interesting evolution. But without the Rastafarian, I think a lot of the history and iconography, the actual books and symbols of the Imperial period might well have been lost.
I know there are several questions that I think you can talk to Gregory at the reception, and we'll stop right here.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.